It's become trendy to dunk on boomers, and I don't want to be that cool. My intention in this video is not to disparage them. I have lots of great colleagues who are some of the wisest, smartest, and most capable people I know, and they're boomers. But I operate in a very unique circle, and when you go outside of that, there is undeniable characteristics and traits among this group, this generation. You can see it in polling, which I'm going to talk about. You can see it in various movements. And so, one of these traits that is more common among this group is that they seem to be more susceptible to deception and propaganda. And so, I think about these things and I wonder, why is that? And I'm going to give you three reasons that I came up with that I think are on the money. I bet you if you looked hard enough, there's someone else who has expressed these. I haven't found them. I just came up with it. And I think they're just common sense observations. But the latest observation, as far as what made me think about this, is I attended a Thomas Massey rally on over the weekend. And so I don't know if you're paying attention, but Thomas Massey is a legislature out here in Kentucky. He's a representative. He's not in my district. He doesn't represent my district, unfortunately. But anyway, he's become a pretty big deal. And part of the reason is because President Donald Trump is trying to oust him from Congress. And the reason, as I see it, as many see it, is essentially because Thomas Massey does not bow down to the White House. He does not bow down to party politics. He's what we refer to as a constitutionalist. So he has these principles, these constitutional principles, which were put into motion by the framers, by the first generation of founders and leaders and whatnot. And among them is this idea that you can't go to war without permission from Congress. Now, this is an idea. This is actually a law. It's a constitutional law. And I don't want to get into the details of the Constitution, which there are not that many, but it's pretty clear that Congress has the power to fund and to start wars, whereas the commander-in-chief, his only duty is to essentially carry out the war once that war has been approved. This is pretty clear. You read the Constitution, if you read it with an objective frame of thought, that's the conclusion. So anyway, Thomas Massey was among the few who said that the president has no permission to, for instance, bomb Iran's nuclear sites. Now, a lot of people would argue that's not war because I guess you don't send troops on the ground. That's just idiotic. Obviously, it's war. It's an act of war. If someone came and bombed anything on the U.S. territory, on the U.S. homeland, we would consider that an act of war. What happened in Pearl Harbor? They came and they bombed planes, and of course, they killed people and whatnot. This is no different. This is not different. It's an act of war. Anytime we drop bombs or issue any aggressive action against any other country, it's an act of war. It doesn't matter what the White House calls it. It doesn't matter what Congress calls it. It doesn't matter what the New York Times calls it. Whatever propaganda emanates to conceal what is obvious here, it's an act of war. Now, that's one of the few things that apparently has triggered the president. Thomas Massey also voted against his massive, I think, a number of spending bills, including Trump's one big beautiful bill where he basically crammed everything in there. It's expensive. It funds all sorts of stuff, and it's projected to raise the debt. I don't know when I did a story. I remember somewhere between $3 and $4 trillion. I think some estimates said up to $5 trillion. Now, of course, all that is arguable, and the White House's defense is that if growth erupts, and it flourishes, then that debt is going to be erased. Obviously, that is not what is happening right now. We're going through some hard times, and there's no signs that there's this massive growth. Anyway, so that was Thomas Massey basically got on the president's nerves too much, and so he issued this order essentially to get rid of this guy. His campaign people, his operatives went out and they created they found some weird, like, warm body. I think that's exactly what Trump called them. They were basically just looking for an empty meat bag suit that Trump can basically control, because that's what he thinks Congress is supposed to do. He thinks these people are there to basically vote with him. He thinks all Republicans are there to do what he wants. He thinks he's like a CEO slash dictator slash monarch who's there to basically do what he wants, and Congress is there to support it. And that's obviously not the way it works. If you read the Federalist Papers, you'll realize that, I think it was Hamilton who said that the president is very different from the king in a slew of ways, including the fact that he can't, he doesn't have the power to declare war. So the president, in the framers' mind, was not supposed to have as much power as he does today. Trump obviously doesn't know that. He's mad about that. And so he wants to get rid of Thomas Massie, who's one of the few who actually has a backbone and who actually will not bow down to the president. So this race is going to be huge. Anyway, why am I talking about this with boomers? The only demographic that Thomas Massie is not winning by bigly is boomers, 65 and up. And that seems to be the only demographic that thinks that this other guy named Ed Galrine is anything but a puppet that's been bought and paid for by out-of-state neocons who love foreign wars and all sorts of other and all sorts of deviant legislation and things like that. These people are not Republicans in the sense of the word that most people think. They're not conservatives, but yet the boomers in this district are the only reason this is a tight race, and it's because they're fooled into believing that. They believe the ads. There's an ad that's going around. It's like this AI ad. It's like so severed from reality, and it shows Massie going to a hotel with like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, And so there's a disclaimer there saying that this is not real, but everyone knows why they created that ad and why they're rolling it on Fox News, because they think that older people are too stupid to know that it's AI. And I think some of them are. They just don't understand. They're too removed from the way that technology has moved to comprehend that now we have technology that could create, just realistic images of things. So I want to talk about why I think boomers are so susceptible to propaganda, to lies, and to bad ideas in general, because they seem to be most supportive of this neocon apparatus that pushes more wars, higher spending, and all of that. What it does in general, all the legislation, everything, we've got this rising police state at the expense of our freedom and whatnot, and they're kind of like big supporters of that. They're the big push behind the Republican Party. So I wanted to get into why is that? Why are these people, why is this generation, generally speaking, again, I'm an individualist, so I know there are some many exceptions, and I'm grateful for those. And of course, there's many exceptions among other generations too. Millennials are kind of, in my opinion anyway, they seem to be a combination of the worst, where you have the naivety and the believability of the boomers while having the convictions of this like crazy leftist, BLM loving, Antifa loving crowd. And so that they seem to be the worst generation. But I guess I'm a bit of a generation bigot, because I'm Generation X, and we're basically the coolest generation. We grew up without the internet, but we saw the internet come up, and we had the last. We were there with the last generation of cool music before everything got bad and it never recovered. And there's lots of other things I think that make Generation X probably the best generation that's alive. We still played outside. We took risks. Our parents were the kind that kicked us out of the house and made us go play outside with sticks and all sorts of risky stuff. We didn't have cell phones and whatnot. So we're definitely the coolest generation. But this isn't about us, Gen X. This is about the boomers. So here are the three reasons that I think boomers are the way that they are. And hopefully this leads to an understanding where maybe you can use that. First of all, you have to think that boomers grew up in a very prosperous and relatively free America. And so what that did is it gave them little reason to question necessarily their government authority. I know there was stuff happening in the 60s and 70s, but I'm talking about more like the conservative boomers who weren't hippies and whatnot. And even the hippies today who are, they're so supportive of Democratic Party, which is just outright authoritarian. It's like there's no pretense there. So even the hippies grew up into these boomers who are very naive and very fooled and believable of all this propaganda and supportive of authoritarian government policies. And again, relatively speaking, the boomers grew up in a prosperous America. They grew up in an America that was relatively free. They got to go out and do whatever they want. Nobody ever forced them to take a jab. Obviously, they did now, but whatever. It's like by this time they've been formed, and so they didn't question necessarily their government because they were. It was on the heels of World War II. Their parents were part of the greatest generation, and if you think about that, imagine being raised by that. I mean, that was a huge event in U.S. history. And of course, the Americans swooped in and saved the day. The British had held off the Nazis and the Axis powers. And there were all these great stories, and America emerges as the biggest superpower and whatnot, and rich, and there's all this investment, and suburbs are being built and whatever. And that's the world they grew up in. That's not the world that Gen Z is growing up in. It's not the world Gen Alpha is growing up in. It's a different world now, and unfortunately, it's much worse. Also, boomers have been marinating in a very controlled and curated media atmosphere, an ecosystem that didn't have any challengers as you have now, mainly thanks to the internet. So the media, whether it be news and news, entertainment, especially, all of that is controlled by a few major corporations, and also like the CIA and various intelligence outfits. I mean, it's documented that there was like 400 or something journalists on the payroll of the CIA. The media is fake, and this is the world that the boomers grew up in. There was no internet. There was no podcast challenging the conventional ideas on anything. It was basically an ecosystem wherever you go, whether you open the newspaper, whether you watched Fox News or CNN or ABC, NBC or whatever. It's like there were a few general ideas that were prevalent on both sides. So none of that was ever challenged. I mean, there were smaller magazines like, the New American, American Opinion, whatever, reviewed the news, and there were others. Of writers, a few here and there, Anthony Sutton's, and a small coalition of dissident writers and thinkers and independent thinkers and whatever. But there was no internet. There was no movements that were massive, that had this critical mass appeal and power as we do now with these big podcasts that are just way larger than what the numbers they're getting at CNN and even Fox, who's basically the only big media juggernaut that's still doing well and left standing. Which brings me to my last point, and is that they're still there. While you do have the Tucker Carlsons and the Man in America and, the Joe Rogans and, whoever it is. And then there's some other more obscure ones. I like the redacted podcast guys. And, there's just so many folks. Sean Ryan does a good job of bringing people on with, very credible people or experts or people who have this interesting background, have a lot to offer. So there's all these podcasts running around, being everywhere. And you have all these people from various backgrounds who are experts on various things and whatnot. And they present narratives that are contrary to what we're seeing. Now, of course, we're also experiencing a reality that does not match, what the boomers grew up in. But I wanted to put that out there, and I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I think it may help to understand where where they're coming from. So I don't know, maybe next time you talk to one or whatnot, you could tell them, look, I understand, why perhaps you believe what you believe, or why you think that this is good, or whatever, or because it's like you grew up in a world that is very much different from now. And while you have everything, they have the houses, they have all the equity and things like that, the world is not the same for us. And I think we need to be able to explain this to them. The metrics are undeniable, the data are undeniable. We do not live in the world that they grew up in. We do not have the same opportunities. The standard of living has gone down. Everything has become far, far, far more expensive. People are buying houses later. People are not buying, they're not marrying. There's all sorts of problems we have. And these started when they were in charge, when the boomers were in charge. And so the machine started cranking up. And so the results of that, we get to experience the results of that. The debt started piling many, many decades ago, but now it's become a system. It's become a pattern and whatnot. So we are reaping the consequences of something that started on their watch. And I don't know how, it would help if we knew how to explain that to them, because it's just simply not the world that they think it is. And again, I'm going to wrap it up with this. When you look at this context between Thomas Massie and this guy named Ed Galrine, who has absolutely no views of his own, he has refused to debate Thomas Massie, to attend any forums. His one-liners are ridiculous. He is an absolutely ridiculous candidate. And the fact that anyone would buy into it, his stances, he put his campaign promise is that basically he's going to be a yes man for Trump. I mean, he pretty much says that. He advocates for war, which is a ridiculous stance in its own, because we have spent trillions on war and we're not making anything better. Why are we paying $5 for gas here in Kentucky right now? Because of this war. A war to do what? To stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon they never had. And what happened after this war? Well, they're probably more determined to get a nuclear weapon, and the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and we're about to reap some serious consequences because of this. So we're going to learn once again why these ideas are terrible, even though they were supported, and they are supported mostly by this generation, this older generation of Americans who don't realize that the world has changed, and not for the better, and their ideas are at the center of those bad changes. Hey, if you like this, go ahead and what are you supposed to do? Subscribe. You can have a free subscription, or if you want to support me even better, get a paid subscription and make sure to follow me. Thanks, guys.